we've been reading this season, The Spirit of the Liturgy, in the hope that we would grow in our understanding and appreciation of the Mass and the other sacraments. It's been, I would say, a challenging journey. And we were meant to read the chapter on the Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament that I personally think was one of the most understandable and easy chapters. And it was also kind of brief, but I think there's a lot of richness worth commenting today. So I thought that it would be useful for this teaching moment to do something of a timeline so we can see the process. So I think the title was a little bit misleading because the Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament was a theme, but wasn't really the main theme. To me, it seems the main theme was how the Church has grown in its understanding of the Eucharist and of the different dimensions of the Eucharist. So what we're going to do is we're going to speak about how was the Eucharist understood in the first 1,000 years of the Church. We're going to see how the Church evolved in its understanding during the Middle Ages and in the second 1,000 years. Then we're going to see how did the liturgical renovation in the 20th century look at history, and then we're going to see how Benedict XVI kind of tries to bring everything together. So let's look at the first 1,000 years and its understanding of the Church, understanding of the Eucharist. So, was there a reservation of the Blessed Sacrament in the first 1,000 years? No. So there was no reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. No reservation. Does this mean that in the first 1,000 years they didn't believe that the Eucharist was Jesus' real presence? No. Benedict is very clear in saying that the biblical testimony and even the understanding of the Church Fathers, it was very clear for them that the Eucharist was not an ordinary bread, but it was truly the body of Christ. The understanding was going to grow deeper in the future, but right from the start, there was already the affirmation that it was the true presence of Christ. Now, in the first 1,000 years, they have a particular way of understanding these two terms. Corpus verum and corpus mysticum. Charlie, in the first 1,000 years, what did they understand by corpus verum and corpus mysticum? Do you remember that part?
I remember it switches from what we think of it.
Okay, that's true.
I think, so the corpus mysticum is, let's see, so the corpus verum is like the sacramental understanding, and then the corpus mysticum is, or maybe flip it backwards.
Okay, Matthews, do you want to help out?
Just the reverse of what he just said.
Okay, so in the first 1,000 years, when they spoke about corpus verum, what were they thinking about? What was the true body for the first 1,000 years?
The church.
The church. The church was the true body. So what was the corpus mysticum?
Sacrament.
The Eucharist, right? So in the understanding of the church in the first 1,000 years, the true body was the church. And the mystical body was the Eucharist. Right? So this arrangement of terms, I think it's really useful in understanding what were the main themes of their Eucharistic theology. So Kevin, do you want to help us out? What were the main, in the understanding of the Church Fathers of the Eucharist, what were the main kind of trends? What was your understanding like? What was your vision? What were the main themes out there? Okay, Temple.
The audiobook does not really do it for me. There's a real personal presence there, is one of the themes he mentioned.
In the first 1,000 years?
I better believe that as a real
Yes, but that's not the focus of the first 1,000 years? Jason, do you want to help him out?
There's dynamism.
Corporate dynamism.
Yes. Okay. So this is the way that I see it. I would say 3 basic themes: ecclesiological, eschatological, cosmic. Okay? So in the first 1,000 years, that was the feeling. First, ecclesiological. The Eucharist was viewed in an ecclesiological optic. What does this mean? This means that they all understood that the church was really built up in the Eucharist. Let me put it this way. When they thought about communion, they really made it clear that when everybody received communion, everybody became one body. So it wasn't about when I receive communion, I receive Christ. It was more about when I receive communion, I become one body in one Christ with everyone that's receiving communion. So there was that ecclesiological aspect to it. So that's why, and I think this is a really powerful insight, the Eucharist was seen as the sacrament of solidarity and charity. Because if you were receiving communion and you were becoming one body with everyone, it meant that you better care about other people. Because you are receiving one body that makes you one body with everyone else. Right? So the first trend in the first 1,000 years is I would say the ecclesiological trend. The Eucharist builds up the church. The Eucharist makes us one body. If I receive the Eucharist, I must be mindful of everyone else who is also receiving the Eucharist. Right? Because we are becoming one body. How can I be neglectful of those who are one body with me? The second big trend, I would say, is eschatological. Okay? Eschatological. So this is the perspective of the church fathers. They said, when we receive this one body, we are transforming this world so that this world becomes a new world. Okay? So there was that sense that in the Eucharist, we are preparing a new world to come. There was that sense of we are anticipating the future world already in receiving the Eucharist today. Can anyone pick up any specific phrases on the eschatological aspect of it? Let's see if we can read this together. Okay, turn to page 101. Do we all have it? Let's look to the bottom part. Towards the middle of the bottom paragraph, it says, as we see above, the Blessed Sacrament contains a dynamism, which has the goal of transforming mankind and the world into a new heaven and a new earth, into the unity of the risen body. This truth was not seen so vividly as before. It's talking about the things that were lost in the Middle Ages, but it's already pointing out to what the first century brought, an eschatological point of view. And also, I would say, a cosmic point of view that is closely related to the eschatological. Okay. So, this was the perspective in the first 1,000 years. Corpus Verum is the church. Corpus Mysticum is the Eucharist, and the big trends are ecclesiological, eschatological, cosmic. There was no place where the Blessed Sacrament was reserved. Does this mean that there wasn't a veneration for the Blessed Sacrament? No, there was. Yes?
Could you just repeat cosmic again? I missed that point.
So I think cosmic is very closely related to eschatological, but it's the sense that with the Eucharist, the whole creation is being transformed. It's with the Eucharist, the renovation of creation is being accelerated. Because if you think about it, okay? Okay. So Then we move into the second 1,000 years, especially we look into the theology of the Middle Ages, that's going to take a different, let's say, perspective. So Middle Ages. So what's going to happen in the Middle Ages? Let's first address the question about corpus verum and corpus mysticum. Corpus verum, corpus mysticum. So Kevin, in the Middle Ages, now what is the corpus verum? Yes. The corpus verum is the Eucharist, and the corpus mysticum is the church.
So why did it change?
It changes because the focus, like what they're going to center upon, is not so much the ecclesiological, the eschatological, or the cosmic, but the theology of the Eucharist will start to center around the real presence of Christ. That's going to be the focus of the debates and the focus of the theological writings, and also the experience of the saints, just kind of the pathway that things took. The focus is going to be the real presence of Christ. So, for example, the Eucharistic hymns that St. Thomas of Aquinas wrote, Pangelim, Watantum, where do they come from? They come from the Middle Ages, right? Because the focus of the Eucharist was no longer ecclesiological or eschatological, but what really mattered was proving and understanding the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Was the real presence of Christ denied in the first century? No, in the first 1,000 years? No. It was there, but it wasn't really focused on. Okay. So what's going to be the main focus? That the corpus verum, like the real body, is not the church. The real body now is going to be the Eucharist. So he points out a couple of causes or variables that really moved theology in this direction. Who can name any of the things that really moved this shift in focus? Matthews, do you remember what he says? Or Dan Fury?
He said something that I didn't quite, I didn't really understand the background, but the shifts in just sort of language.
Okay, so first I think it's important to understand there's going to be a theological dispute about the real presence that's going to begin in the Middle Ages that hadn't begun first. One of the big names is Berengario de Tours, right? How do you say it in English?
Berengarius.
Berengarius of Tours. So, let me put it this way. What really prompted the change in perspective is that for the first time, people were starting to question or were starting to get interested in understanding how are we meant to understand that the Eucharist is really Christ. So there were certain tendencies that were more, let's say, skeptic about the real presence. So the beauty is that the skepticism moved a more profound understanding of the real presence, right? So for example, this is what my liturgy teacher taught me. I'm not 100% sure that this is right or not, but he said, the church, when it faced challenges regarding the real presence, started to really, let's say, make the opposite statement. So when did they start ringing the bells during Mass? And when did the elevation in Mass start? It all started in the Middle Ages with the desire to really ascertain the real presence, right? So now it was all about the real presence. And it was, first place, a response to those who were doubting within the church. Maybe not doubting, but just trying to understand it better. Benedict also says, other trends that really moved the focus in that direction, he says, the apparition of the Franciscans and Dominicans. I have no idea how are those things related, but they must be related in some way. He also says the life of the saints, the experience of the saints with the Eucharist. And if you think about it, for those who had a chance to watch the Blessed Carlo Acutis display, when did all of the Eucharistic miracles happen, or most of them? Most of the Eucharistic miracles happened in the Middle Ages, in the time of doubts about the real presence. So if you if you do a timeline, how many Eucharistic miracles happened between the 13th century and the 14th century? Like 90% of the Eucharistic miracles. So it's like there was a huge trend in the church where the whole focus was, let us affirm the real presence, and that's going to be the whole focus of the Eucharist, right? So what's the point that Benedict is trying to do about this? I think he tries to make 2 points. He says, in the Middle Ages, some aspects of the Eucharist were ignored or perhaps placed in a second position. So the ecclesiological aspect was forgotten, the cosmic aspect and the eschatological aspects were kind of left aside. So there was, in a sense, there was an impoverishment of the Eucharistic understanding. But he says there was also a profound gain because this deepening of our understanding of the real presence of Christ only happened in the Middle Ages. So on one hand, you won. On one hand, on the other hand, you also lost. Is this clear so far? Okay. So what's going to happen in the 20th century? So you have to remember that in the 20th century, there's a big movement in the church called the liturgical movement, right? The liturgical movement starts at the beginning of the 20th century, and Benedict is not really a part of it. He's a little bit younger. One of the big names of this liturgical movement is Romano Guardini, right? The one who writes the book with the same title, but many years before. We've already talked about this, but one of the issues with this liturgical movement is romanticism of the beginnings. All right? So this liturgical movement had one problem. And you know what was their problem? That the only thing that they valued was what happened at the beginnings. And they thought that everything that happened in the Middle Ages was, decadencia? Decadent. It was a decline. It was decadent. So the nostalgics of the liturgical movement, they said, if we want to renew the liturgy, we have to go back to the first century. We have to go back to the beginnings. Because everything that came in the Middle Ages was an impoverishment of the Eucharistic understanding. That's kind of alluring, right? It sounds good. Like, let's go back to the beginning. Because in the beginning, we will find the answers of how things really were. So what were the difficulties? What were the objections that they were bringing, this movement? They said, Eucharistic adoration, that's an invention from the Middle Ages. So, for example, I was listening to Bishop Barron speaking about the Eucharist, and he said something very interesting. He said, when I grew up in seminary, nobody did holy hours. Because we were brought up in a time where we were taught that the Eucharist was for consuming, not for adorating. Right? He was embedded, or the church in this country and in the world was embedded in the liturgical movement perspective where what really mattered was what came at the beginning. And they thought that whatever came in the middle was an impoverishment of the Eucharist. Right? So that's more or less the air that the church was breathing. Right? They thought that everything that had to do with Eucharistic adoration, everything that had to do with processions, right? With taking the Blessed Sacrament in procession, they said, oh, that's from the Middle Ages. Because if you look at the first 1,000 years of the church, there were no processions. Processions are from the Middle Ages. So that's why I think so many churches gave up on Corpus Christi processions, right? Because they were influenced by this movement that said what really matters is what happened at the beginning, not what came after. Right? What's the beauty of Ratzinger? he sees this not as something decayed, but he sees it as the natural development of what was already present at the beginnings. Right? That growing in our understanding of the real presence, it was at the beginning, but it had to go deeper. So the Middle Ages gave us that better sense of the real presence of Christ. So what is the proposition of Benedict? And this is the beauty of him. I think this is the beauty of the Catholic theology. Catholic theology is normally, it's not this or that. It's this and that. So that's what Benedict tries to do. Benedict, he is critical of this movement because he's a generation after that movement. So he's able to see the good things about it, but he's also able to be critical with it. So he says, yes, there are things to be rescued from the first century, from the first 1,000 years, but there are things that are meant to be rescued from the Middle Ages. So what really we should do is we should bring the best of both moments. So for example, he asked this question. This is a question that comes up a lot. Is the Eucharist meant to be consumed or to be adored? Is the Eucharist there to feed us, or is the Eucharist there for us to contemplate the Eucharist? What's the answer? And he says, it's not one or the other. It's both. So let's go to the second to last paragraph. And he has a beautiful idea there about how eating and adoring are really one act. Kevin, could you read that paragraph?
So let no one say that one.
Yes.
So let no one say the Eucharist is for eating, not looking at. It is not ordinary bread, as the most ancient traditions constantly emphasize. Eating it, as we have just said, is a spiritual process involving the whole man. Eating it means worshiping it. Eating it means letting it come into me so that my I is transformed and opens up into the great we, so that we become one in him.
So you see how he's integrating into our personal piety the ecclesiological aspect of it, right? So he's saying we shouldn't be saying this or that. We have to say both things. So eating is worshiping, and worshiping means becoming part of the big one. Keep going, please.
Thus, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it merely added to it. No, communion only reaches its true depths when it is supported and surrounded by adoration.
Okay, so that's, for example, something that the Church teaches. The Church teaches that the way that you prolong the fruits of the Eucharist is in Eucharistic adoration. So instead of being opposed to each other, communion and Eucharistic adoration feed each other in a positive loop. How is it that you make a more fruitful communion the more time you spend in adoration? Right? Adoration prepares and disposes you for communion. So rather than them being opposed, they really help each other and make the experience more fruitful. And that's why, again, the Church really invites us to incorporate both practices to our life. Frequent communion, but also adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Because communicating and adoring are really one act that help each other. So that's how I think he's bringing together the best of the Middle Ages and the best of the old Church, right? Keep reading, please, Kevin.
The Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration. It simply signifies its complete fulfillment. For this presence has the effect, of course, of keeping the Eucharist forever in church. The church never becomes a lifeless space, but is always filled with the presence of the Lord, which comes out of the celebration, leads us into it, and always makes us participants in the cosmic Eucharist. What man of faith has not experienced this? The church without the Eucharistic presence is somehow dead, even when it invites people to pray. But a church in which the eternal light is burning before the tabernacle is always alive, is always something more than a building made of stones. In this place the Lord is always waiting for me, calling me, wanting me to make Eucharistic. In this way he prepares me for the Eucharist, sets me in motion toward his return.
So clearly he's in favor of keeping the Blessed Sacrament in the church, because that makes the church alive. But he's also making a point about how spending time with the Blessed Sacrament in the tabernacle makes our life more Eucharistic. The presence of the Blessed Sacrament in the church after Mass doesn't oppose the presence of the Eucharist in the celebration. It really prolongs it. It makes our life more Eucharistic, because I sense that people also in the liturgical movement, they would have said, oh, we should have no tabernacles in the church, because in the beginning we had no tabernacle. So why should we keep the Eucharist in the church? But he's saying, no, keeping the Blessed Sacrament in the church doesn't affect the celebration of the Eucharist. It makes it more fruitful, right? So I think that's the greatness of Benedict, his capacity to see the beauty of the church fathers, the beauty of the Middle Ages, and the need to bring everything together, rather than, let's say, turning to a more nostalgic or romantic perspective where the only thing that matters was what happened at the beginning. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So, I guess if we had to have a spiritual takeaway of this, I could say this is a good chapter to help us grow in our understanding of the importance of communion and the terms in which we should do communion. There are really nice words about how communion really wants to make us one body, one spirit with Christ and with all the church. And I also think he makes a great case on the importance of alternating or combining communion with adoration, and how they really feed on each other, and how really someone who adores is someone who makes a more significant communion. And when you do a significant communion, I think you're truly led to adoration. So it's a good chance for us to revive our desire to be men who make powerful communions on Sundays, but also men who want to prolong or to keep this Eucharistic life throughout the week, also with adoration and presence before the Blessed Sacrament.